For
Darkness has
the
always clung to the
eternal
crowns of kings and queens. But some thrones are not merely gilded with gold. They are soaked in blood, whispering curses from the past. Imagine a dynasty so haunted that its very survival came at the expense of its own children. Imagine a royal line where the heirs, the precious lifeblood of the kingdom, were not protected, but consumed. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, but in whispers of ritual, in stories of hunger, in accusations that would outlive the monarchs themselves. This is the story of a bloodline cursed to devour its own offspring. When most of us think of royalty, we imagine splendor, jeweled crowns, endless banquets, and divine right to rule. Palaces filled with music, courtyards alive with color, and an unbroken chain of heirs securing the future of a dynasty. But what happens when that chain is broken, again and again? When heirs disappear under mysterious circumstances, their names erased, their tiny bodies buried before they could even speak. History is filled with monarchs who met tragic ends. Yet the story we're about to unravel feels different. Because here, it was not foreign invaders or political assassins that tore a dynasty apart. It was the dynasty itself. A cycle of death repeating through generations, like a curse feeding on its own flesh and blood. The ancient world had a language for this. To devour one's own children was not simply an act of madness. It was the ultimate sin against nature itself. In myth, the Titan Cronus devoured his children one by one to prevent them from overthrowing him. In folklore across continents, cannibalistic rulers appear as warnings of unchecked greed and tyranny. And in whispered chronicles of certain royal families, those same dark patterns emerge, not as myth, but as whispered history. Some chroniclers claimed it was madness running in the veins of kings. Others insisted it was ritual, that the act of devouring one's heir, whether in flesh or in ceremony, was a way to keep the throne forever unchallenged. And still others whispered of curses, placed upon dynasties by betrayed wives, rival sorcerers, or even divine judgment. But whether curse, madness, or deliberate rite, the outcome was always the same. The children of the crown did not live. The court would hush it away. Official records spoke only of sudden illness, of infant fevers, of heirs who mysteriously did not survive past their first year. But beneath the official scrolls, among servants and midwives and foreign ambassadors, the rumors burned like wildfire. The king eats his heirs. The queen drinks the blood of infants. The dynasty is cursed, and the curse is fed with flesh. We cannot know how much is truth, how much is rumor, and how much is political slander. But what we do know is this: patterns repeated. Heirs perished, dynasties crumbled, and those who survived carried scars so deep, they turned the idea of royal inheritance into something horrifying, something almost unthinkable. Tonight, we step into that darkness. We will trace the origins of this curse, following it back to its earliest shadows. We will examine the chilling deaths of royal children, one after another, until the pattern becomes undeniable. We will walk through the forbidden corridors of the royal court, where secrets festered in candlelit chambers. And we will peer into the minds of monarchs accused of unthinkable acts, trying to understand whether they were victims of madness or perpetrators of ritual. But we will also step outside the palace gates, to the people who whispered in terror, to the mothers who feared their newborns would vanish, to the chroniclers who risked their lives to write down what was never meant to be remembered. This is not a tale of ordinary scandal. It is a tale where history and myth entwine so tightly, it is almost impossible to pull them apart, where the hunger of power and the hunger of flesh blur into one, where a dynasty's own survival became its undoing. Ask yourself, if you were born into such a bloodline, would you consider yourself blessed or cursed? To be born in silk, but never to survive beyond childhood? To inherit a throne that might one day demand your life as payment? And ask this: if kings and queens did, in fact, devour their own children, did they do it because they had to? Because they believed that consuming the blood of their heir would keep them strong, unchallenged, and eternal? Or was it madness, paranoia, and cruelty taken to its furthest extreme? We may never know for certain, but in the shadows of history, the whispers remain. So let us begin at the start, in the myths that shaped these rulers' world, in the ancient stories where gods and kings devoured their own bloodline. Because sometimes, Myths are not merely stories. Sometimes they are warnings. And when you follow those warnings deep enough, you may discover the chilling possibility that the curse was real. Every dynasty begins with a story. Some begin with conquest, others with divine blessing. But this one began, or so the whispers claim, with a betrayal so deep it echoed across generations. The curse, they say, was not born in the cradle of a royal child, but in the chamber of a wounded heart. Centuries before the bloodline reached its height of power, a king stood at the center of betrayal. Some chronicles say he had promised loyalty to a powerful queen, only to cast her aside for another. Others insist he betrayed an oath made to the gods themselves, breaking a sacred vow in his hunger for power. Whatever the truth, that betrayal unleashed more than anger. It gave birth to a curse. In the oldest versions of the tale, the wronged queen did not weep. She did not beg. Instead, she turned to something darker. To the priests who spoke in riddles, to the shamans who invoked night spirits, to the forbidden rites whispered only at moonless midnight. And there, in a temple no longer standing, she laid her hands upon an altar and spoke words never meant for mortal tongues. The price she demanded was simple, that no child of his bloodline would live to inherit the throne. Of course, skeptics will say this is only legend, a tale told centuries after the fact, to explain away a dynasty's repeated tragedies. Yet what is legend if not a mirror of fear? And here, the fear was overwhelming. Heirs who died mysteriously, kings who outlived every child they bore, queens who carried their infants to the grave again and again. It was as though an invisible hand reached into every cradle, snuffing out life before it could blossom. The earliest chronicles that survive describe these events in hushed, evasive tones. Official scribes would never admit that the dynasty was cursed. Instead, they spoke of divine punishment, or of strange fevers that spread only through the royal nursery. But foreign ambassadors wrote more openly. They sent letters back to their homelands, describing the eerie coincidence of heirs who never reached adulthood. Some even claimed to have seen processions of tiny coffins leaving the palace under cover of night. Was this the hand of disease? Was it the result of inbreeding, a common shadow among royal bloodlines? Or was something far more deliberate at work? The culture of the time was steeped in superstition. To devour an enemy's heart was to take their strength. To drink blood was to inherit courage. To consume the flesh of one's kin, even in ritual, was to bind their spirit forever. These beliefs were not isolated. Echoes of them can be found in civilizations from the Mediterranean to the Far East. And so, when heirs vanished, people whispered the unthinkable, that their own parents had consumed them. At first, such accusations seemed absurd, born of slander or fear. But then came the stories too consistent to ignore. Infants who were born healthy and strong, only to be taken away on the very night of their birth. Midwives who disappeared without explanation. Rumors of ritual feasts where the wine was darker than wine should be, and the meat served was never named aloud. And always, the same explanation from the court. The child was lost to illness. But why? If there was truth to these whispers, why would a dynasty devour its own blood? Some historians suggest it was never literal. To devour one's child, they argue, was a symbolic phrase. Heirs were consumed by the greed and paranoia of their parents, never allowed to live freely, destroyed by court intrigue before they could rise. A metaphor, not a massacre. Yet folklore resists that interpretation. Too many tales speak of flesh, of blood, of rituals that blurred metaphor into horror. Too many outsiders recorded the same whispers, with the same words. It is here, in this space between history and myth, that the origins of the curse take shape. Imagine being a subject of this kingdom, watching as generation after generation lost its heirs. Imagine the whispers in the market stalls. The king has eaten his child. The queen's womb is cursed. The bloodline is doomed. Fear spreads faster than fact, and soon, fear becomes fact. The people believed it, and in their belief, the dynasty's image twisted into monstrosity. Even if the curse began as rumor, it gained a life of its own. Every stillborn child, every sudden death, every vanished heir added fuel to the fire. The dynasty became defined not by its victories, but by its losses, by the emptiness of its nurseries, and the graves of its children. And so, by the time the dynasty reached its height, the curse was already woven into its identity. The rulers could not escape it. Every time a child was born, the court held its breath, waiting for death to come. Every time a child died, the whispers grew louder, darker, more detailed. The curse was no longer just a story, it was an inheritance of terror. In the great halls, portraits of kings and queens gazed down with solemn eyes, yet behind them, in the shadows, lurked a legacy that no crown could silence. It is here, in these early tales of betrayal, forbidden ritual, and vanishing heirs, that we find the first roots of the curse. And if the roots were this twisted, imagine what horrors would bloom in the centuries to come. In every dynasty, the birth of an heir is a moment of triumph. Trumpets blare, bells ring, courtiers shower the cradle with gifts, and the people rejoice at the promise of stability. A royal child means the future is secure. But in this bloodline, the sound of a newborn's cry carried no joy. It carried dread. For in these halls, heirs were born not to live, but to die. The chronicles whisper of infants who breathed for only a single night, of toddlers struck down by sudden fevers that no physician could name, of princes who vanished in the stillness of midnight, their cradles left empty by morning. The pattern was undeniable, though the court scribes worked tirelessly to disguise it. One court record notes the birth of a strong, healthy boy, destined, so it seemed, to unite a fractured kingdom. But before his first year was complete, he was gone. The official story was illness, yet an ambassador wrote privately to his homeland. The prince was taken. I heard the servants speak of blood on the floor, of the queen's chambers sealed, of a feast that followed too soon. Another chronicle tells of twin daughters, radiant with life, adored by the people. Their survival should have been a miracle, but within weeks, they too were lost. The explanation? A mysterious plague that touched no one else in the palace. Some swore the king himself ordered them removed, fearing two daughters would split the future crown. Others whispered something darker, that the royal table bore dishes that night which no servant dared to name aloud. It is easy, across centuries, to dismiss these accounts as exaggeration. But the pattern is relentless. Each generation echoed the last. Heirs born, heirs buried. Cradles filled, cradles emptied. And the people began to notice. For commoners, death was familiar. Infant mortality stalked every home. But in the royal household, where the best physicians, herbs, and protections were at hand, the deaths felt uncanny. Too frequent, too precise, too deliberate. And so the whispers began, that the crown devoured its children. What does it mean to be devoured? For some, it was literal, the image of kings and queens feasting upon their young, drinking blood to preserve their reign. For others, it was spiritual, that the ruler's hunger for power consumed every child before they could grow. Either way, the effect was the same. Hope for the dynasty's future turned to horror. Every time a child was born, the court trembled. Would this one survive? Or would another tiny coffin slip through the palace gates at dawn? One tale, preserved in the writings of a foreign monk, is among the most chilling. He tells of a prince who survived longer than most, nearly 7 years. The people loved him, calling him their little son. But as the boy grew, so too did his strength and his resemblance to his father. And then, abruptly, he was gone. The monk claims the boy's disappearance coincided with a banquet, a celebration too lavish for no clear reason. The servants, he wrote, were forbidden to speak, but their eyes betrayed a terror that words could not. Was the child taken by illness, by poison, or by something far worse? We may never know. What remains is the silence, the emptiness, the absence of a future. In these repeated tragedies, one can feel the weight of paranoia pressing down upon the royal family. Perhaps they truly believed their line was cursed. Perhaps they sought to break it through sacrifice. Or perhaps the curse was not supernatural at all, but the curse of power itself, a crown that demanded the destruction of its own bloodline in order to survive. Historians have tried to explain it. Some point to genetic illnesses bred by centuries of inbreeding, conditions that caused infants to die young. Others suggest political assassinations, rivals eliminating heirs to destabilize the throne. But even these rational explanations fail to account for the sheer consistency, the ritual rhythm, of the deaths. And the people, living under the shadow of this dynasty, were less interested in science. They saw a pattern, and to them, the pattern meant one thing: curse. The fear bled beyond the palace. Women across the kingdom whispered warnings to each other. Do not let your child be chosen for the court. Do not let them serve in the nursery. Do not let them be near the royals. Midwives prayed before entering royal chambers, terrified that the birth they assisted would end in horror. Some servants fled their posts entirely rather than stay near the cursed cradle. The dynasty became a spectacle of dread. Foreign visitors recorded the absence of heirs at official ceremonies. Neighboring rulers mocked the family's inability to produce successors. Yet beneath the mockery lay a deeper fear, because if the curse could strike one royal house, why not another? And still the cycle continued. A daughter born, gone within weeks. A son born, celebrated, gone within months. A child who survived to walk, to speak, to laugh, only to vanish before adolescence. Each disappearance added another link in the chain of horror. Each death reinforced the legend. The people no longer asked if an heir would die, but when. The throne stood gleaming, yet empty. Its heirs never sat upon it. The dynasty seemed eternal, and yet, without children, its eternity felt like mockery, a crown without a future, ruling over shadows. By the time generations had passed, the curse was no longer questioned. It was assumed. Foreigners arrived, already whispering of it. The dynasty's own subjects no longer believed in hope. And the rulers themselves, those who sat upon the bloodstained throne, lived in constant terror of their own nurseries. Imagine being a monarch, waiting for the cry of your newborn child, knowing that sound may soon become the tolling of a death knell. Imagine walking through the palace, every cradle reminding you of loss, every empty bed a reminder of the future stolen from your line. This was not a family. This was a graveyard in disguise. And yet, despite the horror, the dynasty endured. Kings continued to rule. Queens continued to reign. The throne stood unbroken. But beneath it, in the shadows, lay the bones of children who never had a chance to live. And so the curse deepened. From whispers in dark corridors to legends carved into history, the tale of the heirs who never lived became inseparable from the dynasty itself. The rulers wore crowns, but they also wore the weight of every lost child, every vanished heir, every name erased from the record. This was no ordinary dynasty. This was a bloodline that devoured its own. Behind the marble pillars and golden drapes of the royal court, shadows stretched longer than the daylight. The palace glittered like a jewel to outsiders, its halls filled with silk, its banquets laden with food, its throne gleaming with divine authority. But those who lived inside its walls knew the truth. The court was a mask, and behind that mask lay something unspeakable. Whispers of the curse grew loudest not among peasants in the marketplace, but within the palace itself. Servants spoke of locked chambers where no torch was allowed to burn. Midwives told of newborns taken from their arms before their mothers could even hold them. Guards swore they heard cries in the night that were suddenly silenced. The deeper one went into the palace, the more the air thickened. Corridors that seemed endless, doors that never opened, banquet halls that reeked faintly of smoke and iron. And at the center of it all, the throne room, a place of glory by day, but a chamber of dread by night. At royal banquets, the table groaned under the weight of roasted meats and golden chalices brimming with wine. To the visiting nobles, it was splendor incarnate. But the servants who carried the trays whispered otherwise. Some dishes, they claimed, were never served to guests. Covered platters carried to the monarch's private table, their contents unseen by anyone but the ruler's closest attendants. What was beneath those lids? The question tormented the imagination of every onlooker. For once, a servant claimed to see what should never be seen, a plate upon which lay something far too small, far too human. The servant disappeared within days. The story, however, never died. It was not only food that raised suspicion. Certain nights, the palace glowed with torchlight long after midnight. The priests and astrologers of the court were summoned, their chants echoing through stone halls. Musicians were called to play strange, dissonant tunes, repeating notes until they droned like spells. Courtiers were forbidden to attend, yet the sound carried through the palace. Those who heard it swore the ceremonies were not of this world. Some described rhythmic stomping, like the march of countless feet. Others whispered of screams smothered beneath the music, brief cries quickly swallowed by silence. By morning, the palace would be calm again, its floors scrubbed spotless, its rulers smiling as if nothing had occurred. But the unease lingered. In the private chambers of the monarch, the curse was felt most keenly. Queens who bore children lived in terror, for they knew the fate that awaited their infants. Some resisted, attempting to protect their babies in secrecy. Yet resistance came at a terrible cost. One tale tells of a queen who hid her child in the servants' quarters, disguising the boy as a commoner. The deception lasted mere weeks. When the king discovered it, the child vanished overnight, and the queen was never seen in public again. Another chronicle tells of a young princess who survived to adolescence. She was kept hidden from the people, confined to her chambers under the guise of illness. Yet one evening, guests swore they saw her led into the throne room in a white gown, surrounded by priests. By dawn, she too had vanished. The official record claims she died of a wasting sickness. The courtiers who whispered in secret told a darker tale, that she had been offered as a sacrifice to lift the curse, her life devoured by those sworn to protect her. And then there were the rumors of the hidden chamber, a place beneath the palace, accessible only through a staircase concealed behind the throne. Servants spoke of carrying torches into the stairwell, only to be dismissed before they could glimpse the bottom. But one soldier claimed to have entered during a rebellion. What he saw, he never fully described, only that the walls were lined with bones far too small to belong to grown men, and that the air reeked of decay and incense. He never returned to the city again. His words, however, spread like wildfire. The hidden chamber became legend, the supposed heart of the curse itself. Whether real or imagined, its shadow hung over every banquet, every coronation, every royal birth. Foreign ambassadors did not miss these whispers. In their letters, they painted a palace divided between grandeur and terror. One Venetian described the court as a place where the candles burn longer than the children. A French envoy wrote, "They smile in daylight, but at night, there is a silence too heavy to be natural." These letters were never meant for the people, yet copies survived, fueling the dynasty's reputation abroad as much as at home. Even allies began to hesitate. To marry into this bloodline was to risk feeding the curse. Dynastic unions collapsed. Potential queens fled negotiations. And the palace, once the symbol of wealth and power, became a cage of secrets. Inside, those secrets thrived. Courtiers who tried to expose the truth vanished. Servants who spoke too freely were silenced. One tutor, beloved by the young princes, dared to complain when his pupil disappeared. Within days, he was found drowned in the river, his pockets filled with stones. The message was clear: silence or death. And so silence reigned. The palace gleamed. The banquets dazzled. The people bowed. Yet beneath the performance, everyone knew the truth. They knew what the court could not admit, that the dynasty was devouring itself from within. The most terrifying part was not whether the rulers were guilty. It was that no one knew the extent of it. Were the deaths of heirs part of ritual cannibalism? Or were they sacrifices carried out in secret chambers? Or was it simply paranoia, accidents twisted into monstrous rumors? The uncertainty itself became a weapon. The palace thrived on shadows. And in those shadows, truth and myth blurred until they were indistinguishable. As centuries passed, the stories grew darker, not lighter. New rulers tried to distance themselves from the curse, but the palace walls whispered louder than their proclamations. The secrets of the royal court were never erased. They were only buried, like bones beneath stone. And as long as the dynasty endured, the secrets endured with it. The curse was never faceless. Behind every vanished heir, every silenced cradle, stood a monarch. Kings and queens who bore the burden of power, and whose names became tangled forever with whispers of madness. It is here, in the lives of these rulers, that we glimpse the darkest corners of the dynasty. For if the bloodline was cursed, then it was their hands that carried out its will. The earliest king accused of devouring his heirs was remembered as a conqueror. To his subjects, he was a warrior who expanded the kingdom's borders and bathed in the glory of victory. But behind palace walls, his victories came at a cost his people never saw. Chroniclers wrote of a man tormented by visions. He feared betrayal at every turn, and none frightened him more than the thought of being overthrown by his own children. In private, he muttered that his sons would become his killers. To silence the threat, he silenced them first. One account claims he summoned priests to his chambers, demanding they perform rituals to bind his power. The rituals required blood, royal blood. Soon after, his children began to vanish. The people mourned, but the king showed no grief. He stood taller, prouder, as though each disappearance made him stronger. Was he truly consuming them, as the whispers claimed? Or was he merely consumed by paranoia? The line is thin, and history refuses to answer. Generations later, another ruler, a queen this time, carried the curse further. Where her predecessors feared betrayal, she feared weakness. Obsessed with immortality, she surrounded herself with alchemists who promised eternal youth. Their potions, their powders, their rituals all required sacrifice. Her children became subjects of her experiments. Physicians reported that the queen demanded their blood for elixirs of vitality. Whether she believed the blood of youth could sustain her, or whether she had simply descended into delusion, no one dared to say. In portraits, she appeared radiant, ageless, her eyes sharp with unnatural brightness. But behind her beauty was horror, a trail of dead infants, of heirs who never lived long enough to inherit her throne. Perhaps the most infamous monarch was a later king whose reign was marked not by conquest, but by madness laid bare. He was said to wander the palace at night, barefoot, muttering to himself, sometimes laughing, sometimes weeping. He refused to allow his children to be seen in public. When asked about them, he would smile strangely and reply, "They are with me always." Ambassadors noted the absence of heirs at ceremonies, yet the king behaved as though they existed. At banquets, he ordered chairs placed beside him for his sons. He raised goblets to empty seats, speaking to them as though they were present. And still, no one outside the palace ever saw these children alive. By the end of his reign, the people no longer spoke of him as king, but as a madman, one who had devoured his own flesh and now dined with their ghosts. Were these rulers truly mad, or were they enacting rituals too dark for us to comprehend? The evidence is tangled. Chroniclers often blurred fact with rumor. Foreign visitors exaggerated tales for their own political gain. And yet, the consistency of the accusations cannot be ignored. King after king, queen after queen, bound by the same obsession, the same paranoia, the same horror of their own children. Some historians argue that madness itself was the dynasty's inheritance. Inbreeding, isolation, and the crushing weight of divine kingship twisted their minds. In this view, they did not devour their children through ritual cannibalism, but through neglect, cruelty, and psychological torment. The curse was not supernatural, it was hereditary. But the legends of flesh, of blood, of feasts in the night, remained too powerful to dismiss entirely. Imagine the throne room, filled with courtiers bowing in obedience, while the ruler upon the throne carries secrets no subject could fathom. Imagine a king who sees every child not as hope, but as a threat. A queen who looks at her newborn and sees not love, but a potion ingredient. To rule is to protect the realm. But for these monarchs, ruling became consuming. Their paranoia consumed their children, their rituals consumed their heirs, and in time, their madness consumed themselves. The most haunting part is that the rulers seemed to believe they were right. To them, the sacrifice of children was not madness, but necessity. Each death was an offering to secure the throne, each vanishing heir a safeguard against rebellion or divine wrath. In their twisted logic, killing their own bloodline was the only way to preserve it. This is the paradox at the heart of their reign. To save the dynasty, they destroyed it. To protect their legacy, they erased it. And in doing so, they became monsters remembered not for their victories, but for the children who never lived. And so the curse passed from one ruler to the next, entwining itself with the crown. Madness became tradition, cruelty became policy, and horror became inheritance. The court may have hidden it, the scribes may have softened it, but history remembers. And in remembering, the truth emerges. The monarchs themselves were both the victims and the perpetrators of the curse. They did not merely wear the crown. They were consumed by it. Behind every vanished heir, behind every whispered ritual, lies not just a dynasty's shame, but the grief of human lives destroyed. The victims of this curse were not only royal children, but mothers, servants, and entire kingdoms shackled to the terror of a throne that devoured its own blood. It is here, in the stories of those victims, that the true horror comes alive. The most obvious victims were the children themselves, infants carried into this world with the promise of crowns, only to be silenced before they could even speak. We cannot hear their voices, but we can imagine their absence. Imagine the sound of a cradle left empty, the stillness of chambers once filled with hope. In the eyes of the people, these children became phantoms, symbols of a future always stolen. But for their mothers, the loss was more than symbolic. Queens were forced to bear child after child, knowing each one might never survive. Some died in childbirth, weakened by repeated pregnancies that ended in sorrow. Others lived long enough to hold their babies, only to see them taken away. Their grief was silenced by the court, their cries muffled behind locked doors. For to weep too openly was to admit what could never be spoken, that the dynasty itself was the murderer. The servants, too, carried the scars. Midwives tasked with delivering royal children often disappeared after the birth. Some were executed for failures, accused of bringing illness into the nursery. Others vanished more quietly, swallowed by the same shadows that took the infants. A few escaped and spread rumors, stories of babies carried away under cover of night, of blood-stained linens hidden before dawn. Nurses and tutors, bound by duty to protect the heirs, faced impossible choices. To protest meant death, to obey meant complicity. One tutor, beloved by his young prince, was said to have collapsed in grief when the boy disappeared. His body was later found at the edge of the palace grounds, hanged by a rope no one admitted to tying. His death, like so many others, was written off as suicide, but the message was clear: silence or join the victims. Beyond the palace walls, the people suffered too. For a kingdom without heirs is a kingdom without certainty. Each time a royal child died, the fear of collapse spread like wildfire. Farmers wondered if war would follow. Merchants feared trade would dry up without stability. Soldiers whispered that enemies would pounce upon a kingdom with no future. The curse became more than a palace secret. It became a weight upon the entire realm. Every birth was meant to be hope, yet every death was despair. The people prayed to gods, built shrines, and left offerings in desperation, begging for the curse to end. Yet still, the coffins came. Still, the dynasty devoured itself. The consequences rippled through alliances as well. Foreign kings hesitated to marry their daughters into the bloodline, fearing they would become widows or bear children doomed to die. Neighboring courts mocked the dynasty as cursed, a house so unstable that even its own heirs could not survive. This humiliation weakened the monarchy's influence abroad, making it vulnerable to enemies who no longer feared its legacy. And within, rebellion brewed. For how long could people follow rulers who slaughtered their own children? How long could nobles pledge loyalty to a crown that destroyed its own future? One of the most chilling consequences was the silence forced upon survivors. Rare princes or princesses who lived beyond infancy often grew up in isolation, haunted by the knowledge of siblings who came before them. Imagine being the only child left, knowing the cradle beside yours had once held another. Imagine living every day in fear that you would be next, that you were only alive because the curse had not yet chosen you. Some of these survivors became rulers themselves, scarred and paranoid. They were raised not with love, but with suspicion, treated less as children and more as fragile vessels carrying a dynasty's final hope. Their reigns, when they came, were marked by fear. They trusted no one, loved no one, and often repeated the same horrors upon their own children. Thus the cycle continued. Victims became perpetrators. Consequences became causes. The curse fed itself endlessly. The emotional toll on the kingdom cannot be overstated. Mothers in the villages began to tell cautionary tales to their children. Do not grow too ambitious, or the curse will devour you, too. Ordinary families saw the royals not as protectors, but as predators. Trust in the monarchy crumbled, even as fear kept people obedient. Religion, too, bore its scars. Priests claimed the dynasty was being punished for ancient sins. Some said the gods themselves demanded the sacrifice of heirs. and that the rulers were merely obeying divine will. Others called the rulers heretics, accusing them of serving demons rather than gods. Religious factions clashed, deepening the suffering of the people caught between belief and terror. Yet perhaps the greatest victims of all were those who tried to speak the truth. Chroniclers who dared to write openly about the deaths were censored or killed. Their scrolls were burned, their names erased from history. But fragments survived, letters smuggled across borders, testimonies whispered to outsiders, stories carried by refugees who fled the cursed court. These fragments are why we know anything at all. They are the voices of victims who refused to be silenced, even by death. The dynasty itself, too, became its own victim. For a bloodline that devours its children is a bloodline that cannot endure forever. Each death chipped away at its strength. Each missing heir left the throne weaker, the people more restless, the enemies more emboldened. What began as whispers of curse and madness became the dynasty's undoing. The children were gone, the mothers broken, the servants silenced, the people despairing, and the monarchy itself, doomed by the very acts it believed would preserve its power, was left hollow, haunted, and hated. In the end, the curse's victims were not just those who died, but all who lived in its shadow. A kingdom where hope itself was devoured, where silence was demanded, and where every future ended before it began. And yet, as the curse deepened, something darker still remained, the rituals themselves. For if the deaths of children were not merely accidents, not merely paranoia, but deliberate acts, then the court was not only cursed, it was complicit. If the curse of the bloodline was truly supernatural, then its power must have been fed. And the whispers that slither through history suggest it was nourished not by chance or madness, but by ritual. Rituals so forbidden, so unspeakable, that even mentioning them carried the weight of blasphemy. The first stories describe midnight ceremonies within the palace chapel, long after the court had retired. The great halls, usually filled with light and music, would fall silent. Candles were snuffed out until only a handful of flames burned, their shadows dancing on stone walls. The monarch would appear in robes not of royal silk, but of black cloth embroidered with strange symbols no priest dared to recognize. At the center of the ritual stood the infant, royal blood, untainted, pure. Some say the child was placed upon an altar of marble. Others claim the ruler cradled the child themselves, whispering words in a language older than the kingdom. Then came the offering, a cut across tender flesh, a few drops of blood, collected in a chalice. This blood, the chroniclers say, was consumed by the ruler, who believed it would grant strength, ward off betrayal, and keep the dynasty immortal. Whether superstition or madness, it was a practice repeated through generations. And with each repetition, the curse grew stronger. But the tales did not stop at blood. Some claimed the rituals demanded more, the flesh of the child itself. In the most disturbing versions, the monarchs were said to consume tiny pieces of their children in a perverse communion, believing they were absorbing life itself. Imagine the horror of courtiers who stumbled upon scraps of parchment describing these acts. Imagine the silence of priests who performed the rites, torn between loyalty and terror. These accounts were often destroyed, yet fragments survived, letters smuggled abroad, accusations written in trembling hands. Were these rulers desperate to cheat death? Or were they prisoners of a darker pact, bound to feed an ancient hunger? The rituals did not belong solely to the palace. Across the kingdom, secret societies and cults sprang up, mimicking what they believed the royals practiced. These groups performed their own dark ceremonies, animal sacrifices, bloodletting, sometimes even rumored kidnappings. To them, the royal family was not cursed but chosen, keepers of an unholy knowledge that lesser mortals could only imitate. And so the legend spread, that the monarchy was not merely a line of kings and queens, but a blood cult, sustaining its throne through offerings unthinkable to ordinary people. Religious authorities condemned these practices as heresy, but their words were drowned in fear. Some priests claimed the rituals summoned ancient gods of famine and war, demanding child sacrifice as payment for power. Others whispered that it was not gods at all, but demons, feeding on royal blood through the lips of kings. The most daring accused the rulers of worshipping themselves, believing that by consuming their children, They could reincarnate their own souls into future heirs, ensuring their legacy never truly died. A grotesque cycle of rebirth through destruction. The imagery of these legends was so powerful that even centuries later, artists and storytellers could not resist. Medieval manuscripts depicted monarchs feasting at grotesque banquets, goblets of blood raised high. Folklore turned the cursed rulers into monsters, half human, half beast, with teeth sharpened for devouring flesh. These were not historical records, they were warnings. Morality tales meant to terrify peasants into obedience, to remind them of the horrors that lurked in palaces far beyond their reach. Yet, even as stories, they reveal something profound. The people truly believe their rulers capable of such acts. Whether real or imagined, the rituals had consequences. Each whispered sacrifice eroded the monarchy's legitimacy. Each rumor of blood drinking pushed the people further into fear and mistrust. And yet, paradoxically, the horror also gave the rulers a kind of dark authority. For who would dare rebel against a dynasty believed to feast upon its own children? Fear is power, and power, once tasted, is rarely surrendered. Historians today debate whether these stories of cannibalistic rites were propaganda, fabricated by enemies, or distorted truths. Some argue that the rituals were symbolic, not literal, small drops of blood offered in ceremonies that outsiders exaggerated into tales of devoured heirs. Others insist the scale of the accusations, spread across centuries and cultures, cannot be dismissed so easily. The line between reality and legend blurs. Perhaps the rulers truly drank blood, believing it strengthened their bond to the throne. Perhaps they performed symbolic rites twisted by rumor. Or perhaps they went further still, stepping into the darkest abyss of human taboo, where legend becomes truth. Regardless, the forbidden practices became inseparable from the dynasty's identity. To be a child of that house was to be both exalted and doomed, to live as the vessel of a throne sustained by sacrifice. To be a subject of that kingdom was to live in the shadow of rituals no one dared name aloud. And to be a ruler was to walk willingly into the abyss, wearing the crown not as an honor, but as a shackle binding you to endless blood. It is easy, centuries later, to dismiss these tales as superstition, to imagine that no ruler would ever descend to such depths. But history teaches us a different lesson, that power corrupts, and fear twists the mind into believing any act is justified if it secures the throne. In the flicker of candlelight, with whispers of betrayal in every corner, perhaps the unimaginable became not only possible, but inevitable. The rituals may have ended. The dynasty may have fallen. Yet the legends of their forbidden practices live on, staining their memory forever. And as long as the stories survive, so too does the curse. The curse of the bloodline did not end with the last vanished heir. Its shadow stretched beyond the palace walls, far beyond the dynasty itself. For once a story of kings and queens devouring their own children takes root, it does not simply die. It mutates, it lingers, and it shapes the world that comes after. The political fallout at its height, the dynasty's curse was not only a family matter, it was a state crisis. Every child who disappeared destabilized the monarchy further. Nobles began to question succession. Alliances collapsed when marriages produced no heirs or when royal infants never lived long enough to be wed. Foreign powers circled like vultures. Neighboring rulers mocked the dynasty as the house of devourers, refusing to offer their daughters in marriage. Without heirs, treaties dissolved, and wars brewed at the edges of the kingdom. Armies marched not because of land disputes, but because enemies believed the cursed throne would soon be vacant. The curse thus became a weapon in international politics, a dynasty too unstable to trust, too tainted to ally with, too doomed to survive. The religious legacy religion, too, was reshaped by the curse. Priests sought explanations in scripture, claiming the dynasty was being punished for ancestral sins. Some argued the bloodline had once betrayed the gods, and now divine wrath demanded royal children as sacrifice. Others whispered darker interpretations, that the rulers were not victims, but willing participants in an infernal pact. To drink the blood of one's heirs was not punishment, but worship of gods too terrible to name. This theological fracture split the kingdom. Some subjects prayed fervently for the curse to be lifted, offering their own sacrifices of animals, crops, or gold. Others condemned the monarchy as unholy, warning that to obey cursed rulers was to share in their damnation. The monarchy had once ruled by divine right. But now, many asked, if the dynasty was cursed, did the gods still favor them at all? The cultural memory, even after the dynasty fell, the legends of their cursed practices seeped into folklore. Villagers told stories of kings who turned into beasts at night, prowling the castle halls for the flesh of infants. Mothers frightened their children into obedience with warnings, "Go to sleep, or the Blood King will come for you." These tales evolved into cautionary fables. In some regions, the dynasty became symbols of greed, rulers so hungry for power that they ate their own. In others, they became demons in disguise, proof that evil can sit upon a throne. Artists, too, preserved the horror. Medieval manuscripts showed monarchs drinking from chalices of blood, their eyes wild with madness. Plays and poems cast cursed queens as tragic figures, driven to devour their children in order to survive. Generations later, Gothic novels and operas would revive these images, blending history with myth until the two became indistinguishable. The psychological scar beyond politics and culture, the curse left a psychological wound on the people who lived under it. For centuries, subjects associated the monarchy not with stability, but with dread. A royal birth, normally cause for celebration, became instead a moment of unease. Was this child another victim in waiting? Would the curse claim them before they could inherit? Even ordinary families were touched by fear. Peasants whispered that ambitious parents who pushed their children too high risked losing them, for the curse struck those who reached for crowns. The royal family's doom became a lesson for all. Beware of ambition, for power consumes its own. The historical lessons modern historians view the curse with more skepticism. They argue that tales of cannibalism may have been exaggerated propaganda spread by rivals, or symbolic descriptions of rulers destroying their own lineage through paranoia and cruelty. And yet, even in this interpretation, the legacy is powerful. The dynasty's downfall became a case study in how absolute power corrupts absolutely. A warning that when rulers see their children not as heirs, but as threats, the throne itself becomes a coffin. The story also reflects the dangers of secrecy. The monarchy's desperate attempts to hide the truth, silencing mothers, erasing chroniclers, executing servants, only deepen the horror. History teaches us that what is hidden always festers, and that rumors, once unleashed, are more enduring than fact. The dynasty's collapse eventually, the dynasty crumbled under the weight of its curse. With no surviving heirs to secure succession, the throne passed into the hands of distant relatives, then into the grasp of rivals. Civil war erupted as claimants fought for power, citing the curse as proof that the old line was unfit to rule. By the time the dust settled, the bloodline that had once ruled for centuries was gone, not with a final act of triumph, but with a whimper, consumed by the very hunger it had unleashed. And yet, their absence did not free the people from fear. The dynasty was gone, but the curse remained in memory, in folklore, in the collective imagination. To this day, historians debate whether the tales of blood drinking and child devouring were truth or invention. But the legacy is undeniable. This dynasty is remembered not for its victories, but for its horrors. The immortal curse, perhaps the most chilling part of this legacy, is its persistence. Even centuries later, when children cry in the night, some parents still invoke the story of the cursed monarchs. When dynasties falter, commentators still warn of rulers devouring their heirs. The dynasty is gone, but the curse has become eternal, a metaphor for power that consumes itself, a story too haunting to forget. It is no longer merely history. It is myth. And myths, unlike bloodlines, never die. The dynasty is gone. The palaces have crumbled, their marble altars cracked, their grand halls reduced to ruins. The bloodline that once ruled with terror and splendor has been swallowed by time. Yet the whispers remain. For history does not always remember kings for their victories. Sometimes, it remembers them for their curses. The story of the dynasty cursed to devour its own children is more than a tale of vanished heirs. It is a mirror, reflecting the darkest corners of human power. It shows us how paranoia can transform protection into destruction, how love can be twisted into fear, and how ambition can consume the very blood it depends on to survive. Every royal birth was supposed to be a promise of continuity, of future, of hope. Yet in this dynasty, every birth was instead a prelude to loss, every cradle a coffin in waiting. The throne did not protect, it devoured. What makes this story endure is not whether the rituals were real or imagined, but the truth they represent. Whether monarchs truly drank their children's blood or whether that was legend, the outcome was the same: a dynasty destroyed by its own hand. And this, perhaps, is the deepest horror. Not demons, not curses, not even gods, but the simple truth that those who rule in fear destroy themselves. The victims, mothers who lost their infants, servants silenced for what they saw, children erased before they could live, are the forgotten heart of the curse. Their suffering reminds us that history is not just written by the powerful, but carried on the bodies of the powerless. Yet the dynasty's own rulers were victims too, prisoners of paranoia, trapped in rituals they believed would save them, only to be consumed by them. It is a cycle as old as power itself, rulers seeking immortality, only to guarantee their own destruction. And so the curse became legend, told in whispers across generations, reshaped into folktales and fables, painted into manuscripts and carved into memory. Even now, centuries later, it echoes in the way we speak of power. Politicians who sabotage their heirs are said to eat their young. Dynasties that collapse from within are called cursed. The bloodline has vanished, but its story survives as warning. That power without restraint is its own executioner. But here is the question that lingers, the one that keeps the legend alive. Was it truly a curse, or was it choice? Did supernatural forces demand the sacrifice of royal heirs, or did human ambition disguise itself as destiny? Did demons whisper in palace chambers, or did paranoia and cruelty alone guide the monarch's hands? We may never know, and perhaps that is why the story endures. For uncertainty is fertile ground for fear. As you hear these words, consider this: dynasties fall, rulers die, but the hunger for power never disappears. And in that hunger, the seeds of the curse remain. Perhaps the true curse is not confined to one bloodline at all. Perhaps it lies within every throne, every crown, every seat of power that demands sacrifice in exchange for survival. The dynasty may be gone, but its lesson is eternal, that thrones do not protect. They consume. The dynasty that devoured its heirs may belong to the past, but its shadow stretches disturbingly close to the present. For though palaces crumble and crowns lose their luster, the hunger for power never dies. And wherever power survives, so too does the curse. Dynasties old and new across the modern world, dynasties still rise and fall. Political families, royal houses, and corporate empires alike all carry the same burden: the struggle to pass power from one generation to the next. History repeats itself in quieter ways now. Heirs groomed for leadership are discarded when they threaten the patriarch's authority. Children born into wealth are torn apart by inheritance disputes. Families destroy themselves from within, not with blood rituals, but with greed, betrayal, and paranoia. The imagery may have changed, but the pattern remains: a throne that consumes those meant to inherit it, eating their young. Even today, we use the same language. When corporations exploit young workers, when political leaders sabotage their successors, when dynasties collapse under their own weight, we say they are eating their young. The phrase is metaphorical, yet its roots lie in the same horrors whispered about the cursed dynasty. Power that should nurture instead devours. Leaders who should guide instead consume. This is why the legend of the child-devouring bloodline endures, because we recognize it in our own time. We see it echoed whenever ambition outweighs compassion, whenever rulers choose survival over legacy. The psychology of fear, modern psychology, gives us another lens. The cursed monarchs feared betrayal, feared irrelevance, feared mortality. Today's rulers may not believe in demons, but they fear the same things. They cling to power long after their time has passed, silencing successors rather than preparing them. Fear is the true curse. It drives parents to sabotage children, rulers to crush heirs, leaders to undermine legacies. It is not supernatural, it is human. And because it is human, it endures. Lessons for the present. The story of the cursed bloodline forces us to ask, what happens when leaders stop protecting the future and start destroying it? In ancient times, it meant vanished heirs and dying dynasties. In the modern world, it means squandered opportunities, collapsing institutions, and families torn apart by greed. The details change, but the lesson remains. Power that consumes itself leaves only ruin. And this is why such stories must be remembered, not simply as dark curiosities, but as warnings. The eternal curse. Perhaps the dynasty was never cursed by gods at all. Perhaps it was cursed by something far more universal, the human desire for power at any cost. A hunger that devours children, families, nations, and legacies alike. The monarchs who drank blood or silenced heirs are gone. But the curse lives on in every leader who destroys their own successors, every family that eats itself alive for power, every throne that values control over continuity. The cursed dynasty is not just history. It is prophecy. So when we speak of rulers who eat their young, when we see families fractured by ambition, when we watch dynasties collapse from within, we are watching the curse repeat itself. Not as myth, not as legend, but as reality. The bloodline may have ended, but its warning is eternal. Power that devours its own future will always be cursed.